Back to Novgorod we go, because in Novgorod there is a cathedral that is the oldest cathedral in Russia. Yes, built perhaps by Byzantine masters, but it did survive. It did not survive unscathed, but it survived. Here it is. It is also called the Hagia Sophia, and it is much smaller than the Kievan Cathedral, much more compact. And it has 5 domes. It's a stone cathedral that was commissioned by still another Vladimir of Novgorod in the middle of the 11th century. The original cathedral there was oaken, as well, the forests are everywhere in Russia, so all the original structures were wooden structures, but this one was in stone, and built in the late 10th century, making it the oldest church building in Russia proper, and the oldest building of any kind still in use in the country. But the cupolas are thought to have been added here in the middle of the 12th century, when the cathedral was restored after a fire, and they're helmet-like. Here you can see it right there, which is it's actually on the icon of Our Lady of the Sign, and it has this plan of old Novgorod right here, and of the old Novgorod Kremlin, which is where it all began. And here is the cathedral, and here are the fortification walls. And here's what it looks like today. This is where we began our lecture. And since we're on the cupolas, we started talking about the cupolas, no one really knows where the onion domes came from. This is a brilliant church of Transfiguration on the island of the Kizhi in Karelia, sort of in the north of Russia, not terribly far from St. Petersburg. And these are wooden churches. They, except for the cupolas, they are built entirely without nails. Cupolas are built with nails, but not the churches themselves. And it's very possible, because it's the north of Russia and there were so many Norsemen there, that a number of Swedish master craftsmen helped or showed the way and how these churches were to be built. But the cupolas, the onion domes, if a church has 3 domes, they symbolize the Holy Trinity. Then 5 domes symbolize Christ and the 4 evangelists. 13 domes are usually dedicated to Christ and his apostles. There could be up to 25 domes. This particular church, I think, has 22. And in addition to Christ and the apostles, the other domes may symbolize the 12 prophets. So here is the Transfiguration in Kizhi, and here are the domes of the Cathedral of the Annunciation in Kremlin. In Russian it's Verkhospassky. As I said, the Italian architects built most of the buildings in Kremlin, but the Russians are very proud also to know that presumably some architects from Pskov came to help as part of the Duke Ivan III plans for the renovation of the Moscow Kremlin. And here are the golden domes, and I'll talk about the color of the domes as well. So back to no one knows where these onion domes came from. Some scholars believe that it was inspired by the images of the Ediculi, which is the chapel above the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, right there, and is believed to have, well, sort of an onion dome already in the 11th century. Well, we're not sure, as I said, they don't really know. And then others speculate that it came from Islamic architecture, and here is a beautiful mosque in Samarkand in Uzbekistan. And in the 15th century, Islamic architecture very often had these elongated onion-looking domes. There are different theories trying to explain it. Well, one theory that I always hear is that these bulbous domes were very convenient for snow, because obviously no snow can stick to it and will fall off. Then another theory that the onion domes are easier in executed in wood, and because the originals were all wood, when it switched to stone, they just continued with the same design. This is a 15th century manuscript, and it has onion domes right there. Still another theory suggests that because medieval architects tended in Russia too this time to effect an elongated impression of a church, the onion domes helped with that. And indeed, here, for instance, well, this one is a 12th century church. It's a beautiful church. It's the Church of the Intercession of the Holy Virgin, and it's not far from the city of Vladimir in the northeast of Russia. These churches are called the bijou churches, sort of the jewel churches. They are quite small, they're in perfect proportions, and even though they're not really that tall, but every element in the church architecture tends toward verticality, and as a result they look considerably taller than they in fact are. And then the onion dome on top also has this vertical inclination. Still another, considerably later 16th century church of the Feast of the Transfiguration, and it's in a little village in the Moscow region. And here the Russian love for ornament is beginning to tell itself even in architecture. And as you see, it's just decorated not only with domes, but with these pointed blind arches which are in the kokoshnik shape. And the kokoshnik is a headdress of a traditional Russian costume. Still another, and this one is in Moscow, in the Novodevichy convent in Moscow. And now, speaking of colors, because all these domes, they are in different colors. Well, the gold domes, which are very familiar looking, they symbolize heavenly glory and used to crown cathedrals of main churches, monasteries, convents, as in this case in Novodevichy. They are very often dedicated to Christ or the 12 great feasts of the Russian Orthodox Church. And here is the color red, as always. Here's blue, and the blue domes with stars used in churches dedicated to the Mother of God, to the Virgin Mary. And that is why the Virgin also so often wears, in most cases actually, wears blue, because she belongs to heaven. And then the green domes are typical of the churches that are dedicated either to the Holy Trinity or to separate saints. They could also have silver domes, the ones that are dedicated to separate saints, such as the Hagia Sophia in Novgorod. It has silver domes. And, well, Hagia Sophia is the Holy Wisdom. There are also black domes, but they're usually used in monastery churches. And this one is the Assumption Cathedral in the Selavki Monastery, and built in the 16th century. I suppose monastery, because one essentially buries oneself alive in a monastery, so the domes are black. Well, the most astonishing palette for the domes is of course Saint Basil's in Moscow, and nobody really knows how it came about. It appears to be sort of like flames emptying into the sky. The majority of the onion domes that survived were built in the 16th century or later, even though that little bijou church near Vladimir goes back to the 12th century. And, well, needless to say, one of the most famous is St. Basil's on the Red Square, which was built during Ivan the Terrible's reign. It's possible, and Ivan the Terrible, early 16th century, so it's possible that that contributed to the widespread of dome building in Russia in general. There was also there also appeared the tent-like roofs instead of the drums upon which a dome would sit. Here the roofs become tent-like, right there. And it seems that instead of just crowning it with a cross, the architects felt that that it would be more appealing to have a dome in between, an onion dome, no less. It is believed that the multicolored domes of this cathedral symbolize the blessed Jerusalem that the holy fool Basil presumably saw in his dreams, because it's not really Saint Basil, it's the cathedral of the Holy Fool Basil, or Fool in Christ Basil. But today's scholars are actually relatively recent. They acquired these colors between the 17th and the 19th century, because the original colors were much more somber. It's just that with the development of color and the availability of brighter colors, the Russians just went all for it because they love color. The Russian attitude toward color in the 17th century changed in favor of bright colors. Iconographic and mural art experienced an explosive growth in the number of available paints, dyes, and their combinations. Because, as I said, the original combination was not as exciting or as challenging. And now that I mentioned the Holy Fool Basil, I may as well talk about him just a bit. There are a number of paintings dedicated to him, not less of contemporary artists. And Vitaly Grafov is a contemporary artist, and here he depicts Basil, the Holy Fool, Moscow miracle worker. And this is actually a quote: naked, dirty, and forever mumbling their prayers, they could proffer raw meat to a czar, call him a bloodsucker, and yet still be invited to a royal feast afterwards. Their supernatural powers inspired awe in nobles and peasants alike, and they were seen pretty much in every village in Russia. Here's still another painting, also by a contemporary artist, Sergei Kirillov, and of Basil, the Holy Fool. They were also known as Blessed Fools or Fools in Christ, and they were known in ancient Greece. Well, Diogenes appears to be one of them, the so-called founder of the Cynic philosophy, who lived in a barrel and didn't wash, defecated in the streets, and walked everywhere with a light, and his dogs, which is where we get the word for cynic, looking for an honest man, so to speak. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, they are called Yurodivy or Pahabe. It is no coincidence that the word itself, Yurodivy, which is a holy fool, actually sounds very similar to the word urod, which means ugly or a freak. The more appropriate name, as I said, would be a fool in Christ, which emphasizes that his behavior is not the result of a mental illness, but of religious zeal. So a holy fool was really regarded in Russia almost like a prophet or the apostle. And here is another compelling painting. This is a brilliant painting by Surikov, and we'll be looking at a lot of Surikov paintings once we get to the 19th century, and 19th century Russian art is really brilliant. And this one is dedicated to Boyarina Morozova, the Princess Morozova, who was a very important, who was a real person, a historical personage in Russian history, who during the time of the so-called old believers stuck to her old beliefs, and the old believers made the sign of the cross with the 2 fingers instead of the 3 fingers. And for that she in fact was imprisoned, tortured, and finally died. And here she is taken away She's an old believer, and right here sits one of those Yurodzevы, one of those holy fools who is supporting her, and thus he has the two fingers. He's showing two fingers, but he is not going to be either arrested or tortured because he is a holy fool, and as a result, he knows best. Brilliant painting. And since we are with religion and with religious art, just a word or two about Russian bells. They are sometimes referred by the Russians as singing icons because the Russians feel, just as the icons provide a visual space, religious space, the bells, they establish the acoustic space. And that was also very important. So while icons are scriptures in image, then the bells are scriptures in sound. They're blessed with a ritual containing many of the elements of the rite of baptism. The new bell is blessed with holy water. It is censed both on the outside and on the inside. The priest lays hands and blesses the bell. The Russian church bells are commonly cast with a mixture of bronze and tin, but often a silver is added to give them the extra sound. The technique was almost lost under the Soviets because they were anti-religion, but today it's coming back. Here's one. They're very large. Now the bells that the Russians ring, they are rung only by moving the clapper, not the bell itself. And so many of them are so huge that you can't even move the bell. So it's different from the Notre Dame, for instance, from the Western tradition. Only the clapper is being swung, and it strikes the sides. So as a result, the belfries, the bell towers, needn't be wide. I mean, they need to be wide enough to accommodate the bell. That's often very wide, but they don't need the width to swing the bell. And a very complex system of ropes is used that's designed individually for each bell tower. And the smaller ropes are usually played by hands. The bigger ropes are usually played by feet. And the secret of that technique, well, obviously with the loss of the technique of bell making, there was also the loss of the technique of bell ringing. But again, as I said, it's coming back. There's even a school in Moscow dedicated to that. The biggest, the hugest bell in the world is this 216 ton tsar bell, the royal bell, or the tsar kolokol, as it's called in Russian. Russians treat the bell as a human being as well. So he's the third generation. These are the dimensions. They're enormous. And here is just the bell compared to human size. It was commissioned by Empress Anna Ivanovna, niece of Peter the Great. It was never rung. It was broken during casting. It was almost completed when a fire broke out in the Kremlin in 1737, and then the wooden form that held the bell also caught fire. And what happened was the guards threw cold water on it, and the bell was being cast, so it was very hot, so it cracked. It caused 11 cracks, and a huge piece, 11 tons, fell off. Actually, the bell in Moscow, it's in Moscow today, it's exhibited in the Kremlin, and you can see the piece that fell off, and it was impossible to repair it. In fact, it will take another century before the bell would be actually lifted on its platform. And it is believed that if this bell ever rang, it would be heard at a distance of 60 kilometers. So one wouldn't be advised to be too close to it. And now we go to Moscow because, as I said, in the 14th century, Moscow will rise and will ultimately become the most important city in Russia, It will subjugate Novgorod, it will destroy Novgorod first, then subjugate, it will subjugate Vladimir, and well, ultimately it will subjugate all of Russia. It will learn, again I mentioned this, it will learn its rules from the Mongols. This is a painting by Apollinarii Vasnetsov, who is a younger brother of Viktor Vasnetsov, and he is the one who painted the three bogatirs, the three Russian princes that we saw last time. It seems that Daniil Alexandrovich, who was the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky here, 13th century, founded the Principality of Moscow, which was based on the city of Moscow, except it wasn't the city of Moscow, it was a tiny little village of Moscow. It was well situated in the central river system of Russia and surrounded by protected forests and marshes, and as such the Tatars preferred that the Muscovites did the work for them instead of going to Moscow. It is Moscow is also credited with expelling the Mongols from Russia, but as we saw last time, the Golden Horde really disintegrated from within. So the principality was founded in the 13th century, but the Russians date the founding of Moscow to one Yuri Dolgoruki, which means literally Yuri the Far-Reaching, or he is called George I of Rus. He was a Rurikid prince and lived in the 12th century. So the Russians dated to the 12th century, but as I said, it was very much part of the Vladimir area, of the Vladimir region, because Vladimir was a far more important city at the time. Back to the Mongols, they made the Muscovites ultimately the agents for collecting tribute and granted them the title of the Grand Prince of Russia in recognition for their eager services. But once the Mongols, of course, became weak as a result of the internal disintegration, then Moscow was just as eager to get rid of them, obviously. We looked at Ivan Kalitan, who lived in the 14th century, and he really was the one who began to found Moscow's wealth. He was the chief agent of the Khans, and he enriched Moscow tremendously. And then the principality's importance was much further enhanced when it became the center of the Orthodox Church, because its head, the Metropolitan, fled from Kiev to Vladimir at the end of the 13th century, and then a few years later established permanent headquarters of the church in Moscow, and that truly established Moscow as the center of Orthodox religion, and as a result, soon enough, the center of the political unit. The one instrumental man was Ivan the Great, or Ivan the Third, the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible. Here's a monument. He was the first Muscovite ruler to call himself Tsar, which is a short version of Caesar. Until then, they were called Grand Dukes. And he also saw Moscow as the third Rome, as the successor to Constantinople, because at the end of the 5th century, in 476, Western Rome fell, and then in 1453, the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople, that called itself the New Rome. So to Ivan III, it was logical that now Moscow will become the third Rome. He also married a Byzantine princess from Constantinople, and with her acquired a new coat of arms that sported a two-headed eagle. So since then, the two-headed eagle will be on the coat of arms of Russia. He reigned for 40 3 years, which is just a bit shorter than his horrible grandson Ivan IV, and he tripled his territory through war. He renovated Moscow Kremlin, introduced new legal codex, and laid the foundations of the Russian state. So he is considered the founder. Marta Boretskaya was the mayoress. She was a wife of one of the important men of Novgorod, who was one of the heads of the Deche, the popular assembly, and after the murder of her husband, in fact, continued her fight against Ivan III. But needless to say, in the end, Ivan III dominated and assumed its territories. Here it is. Ivan dispossessed Novgorod of more than 4/5 of its land, keeping half for himself and giving the other half to his allies. Subsequent revolts in the 15th century were punished by the removal en masse of the richest and most ancient families of Novgorod to Moscow, Vyatka, and other northeastern Russian cities. And here, in other words, this is the territory that was conquered, that was assumed by Ivan now as Moscow possessions. Right there, and here's the double-headed eagle. Looks like, on this particular one, looks a bit like a chicken. So Ivan invited the Italian masters to build the Kremlin walls. By this time, the old wooden walls were replaced with white stone walls, but then Ivan needed something even more stable, and the walls were actually built in red brick this time. And here you can see it here, and then the swallowtails, the famous merlons, are not just typical of Moscow. Italian architects built it, so one can see them in Verona on its fortification walls, and also in the Sforza Castle and in other places in Italy. And for a long while the walls did retain their red look, but in the 18th century it was coated white, like other constructions of the time. The Kremlins in Kazan, Zaraysk, Nizhny Novgorod, Rostov-Veliki, and others. So the walls became white. However, with the Russian Revolution and the communists settling in Moscow, they felt that they need to be repainted in red because red looked more true to the ideology. And, well, they're still in red. And this is how they paint them, you see, with a roller. Well, with Ivan III began the development of the autocratic regime in Russia, and then his grandson, who became known as Ivan the Terrible, built on that. In Russian, actually, it translates as Ivan the Menacing, as opposed to the Terrible. The result was the same. He strengthened the position of the Tsar to an unprecedented degree by ruthlessly subordinating the nobles to his will, exiling or executing more often, thousands on the slightest provocation or without any provocation. Well, he came to the throne about the time when Henry VIII of England died, and we know about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Our Ivan the Terrible had 8 wives. He was married 8 times during his 50-year reign. Of the 7 wives he replaced, 2 cheated on him, God bless them. 1 executed, 1 imprisoned. 3 died from illness or poison, we're not sure. 1 was infertile, but was allowed to live a long life. And 1 was imprisoned and murdered for unknown reasons. And here we have our charming Tsar by Viktor Vasnetsov, the older brother of the other one that we saw. Painted close to the year 1900. And another brilliant painting, also of the late 19th century, is by Ilya Repin, at whom we will also look. And this is Ivan the Terrible killing his son Ivan. This painting actually was twice vandalized. The first time the faces were cut at the time during Repin's lifetime, so he had to come to Moscow and repair the painting, and then it was vandalized again not long ago, but not the faces. Here it is. And well, speaking of murder, Moscow icon painting begins pretty much in the 14th century, and a number of painters did come from Novgorod. This one is of Boris and Gleb, and they were the first Russian saints. They presumably were sons of Saint Vladimir, the one who was converted to Christianity, and then at some point they were murdered. According to the two 11th century lives of Boris and Gleb, they were younger children, yes, and both brothers were murdered during the internecine wars between 1015 and 1019. This is a hagiographical icon, or biographical icon, so to speak. In other words, you have the image of the main characters in the middle, and then all around their scenes from their lives. Here they are. They are Boris and Gleb. Here's Rurik, there's Saint Vladimir, and these are all his children. He had a lot, and others. And here Boris and Gleb, so they're the younger generation. The faces are delightful. The faces, in fact, appear to be almost portraits of someone or other. And one of them was older than the other. Boris, I think Boris is older than Gleb, and he's always it's always indicated either with mustache or the beard. And the artists who painted these did a rather good job in conveying personalities. On the sides, the hagiographic elements are very charming. This one, for instance, shows Gleb as he is dreaming of that he's dreaming that he will be murdered, and there's this black dog that's leaning over him as personification of death, and his faithful servant is leaning over him as if hearing him saying something in his dream, having a nightmare. So it's rather charming, and he's in a tent. You can see it in a tent, and then here the murder happens just as he is lying there. Both of them get killed, both the servant and Gleb, and then Gleb's body in the desert between the two carved out trunks, because the early Russians, they didn't have coffins. They would carve out a tree trunk and use that as a coffin, and that's what you see here. They're called koloda. So he is lying between the two kolodas, and then the angels are next to him, and the fire from heaven reaches out to bless him and his martyrdom. Still another of the mid-14th century icon. The problem here is that there's a significant layer of paint on the chasuble, and it looks like 17th century restoration. But otherwise the face is Byzantine, high forehead, deeply creased. The eyes look uncertainly either to the side or to us, not clear. But the loveliest paintings here are the ones on the edges, because this also is a hagiographic icon that depicts the life of Saint Nicholas, and they are very energetic, very lovely, and very individual. And it's very often in the Western art as well as in the Eastern art that one sees far more freedom and individuality on the secondary pieces than on the main piece, instead of the altar, because the altar has to be painted according to the rules of commission. But then all the secondary pieces, such as predellas, for instance, allow far more freedom to the artist. And in this case, it's truly, some of them are delightful. Here, for instance, there are three men in prison, and it's almost comical. It's almost as if whoever painted this piece had a good sense of humor. And here sit the three men, especially the one in the middle is hilarious with his hands sort of leave me alone, don't bother me. And then he is surrounded by the two bookmarks of the red figures, but he is very, very funny. He looks like a little gnome in the forest. And then here's Saint Nicholas, who is expelling devils from a well right here, or a devil from the well. And here are these devils that look almost like cave art back in the 30,000 BC in southwestern France. And here's Saint Nicholas that is brandishing his stick at them, also charming. Still another with Boris and Gleb in mid-14th century. This time they are mounted, and there is a degree of grace and elegance in the horses. Christ again is looking at them, approving their actions. Quite a bit of highlighting around the eyes, which will become common. However, when you compare these two faces from the mid-14th century and these two from the Novgorodian icon, these are far more human faces, as you see. And here is one Christ of the fiery eye, and he certainly looks threatening. It's not the time of Ivan the Terrible yet, but one can easily see how Ivan the Terrible could be depicted in this vein as well. The forehead is very much emphasized with its very deeply painted creases, and he clearly is displeased and expresses concern. This is lovely. Here begins the tradition of the aklads, or the rizas, right there. This one is done in silver and looks like Islamic arabesques, actually, because the pattern is extremely intricate, very beautiful, and remarkably well done. And yes, it looks as if the tradition may come, the tradition of the interlacing in this case, may have come from Islam. The intercession is, the mother is listening to her child, they are holding hands, and the theme exists in the Western tradition as well, where the child intercedes for someone else. They also began to paint crucifixions, and this one also the 14th century. In this case, it's St. John the Apostle who catches attention with his very concerned pose and his head being held. And in fact, the drapery on both him and Mary is done somewhat resembling chiaroscuro. The arch of Christ is, well, it's a Byzantine arch, and we see something like this. This is end of the 14th century, this is middle of the 13th century, so the difference is almost 150 years. This is done by Cimabue, and it is in Santa Croce, and Cimabue was one of the early painters of the Italian Renaissance. And you can see the difference here. Cimabue's depiction is considerably more naturalistic than the Russian depiction. Also, we know the name of Cimabue, whereas it's very rare that in Russian art we know the names of the icon painters, because they essentially worked for the state and as such were unknown. People like Rublev or Feofan Grek are very rare. And then we saw these icons last time. We talked about Theophanes the Greek, Feofan Grek, that who came to Russia in the middle of the 14th century, first to Novgorod, then to Moscow, and worked in Novgorod, then in Moscow. And what is also important was presumably the teacher of Andrei Rublev, at least Andrei Rublev. It appears that he may have worked in the same companionship with Feofan Grek. We looked at these as well, and then we looked at the most famous icon of Rublev, and that is the Trinity. And as you see here, remember the Novgorod school that we saw previously, and this is the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, which essentially is the same time that Rublev is painting. But here there's a narrative element where here Rublev decided to reduce painting just to its essentials, and the essentials are the three angels who represent the unity of Orthodox faith. The problem with the Rublev is that we don't really know what he did paint and what he did not paint. The Trinity seems to have been definitely from his hand, but then there are other pieces that may have been from his hand, and this is one of them, and it is Christ in Glory. It comes from the Deesis, or tier of one of the iconostases, and that's the Dormition Cathedral in Vladimir, and I'll show you, we'll look at the iconostasis again and which tiers are. It is rather stark, it's almost modern in its geometric appearance, with the geometric shapes behind Christ as he's holding his book open and blessing us. And the colors are interesting because Christ himself appears to be, well, it looks yellow, and then behind him is red, then black, and the black part is called the mandorla, and it exists in Western art as well. The mandorla is sort of a halo around the entire figure of Christ that conveys his divinity. It also perhaps conveys the blessed womb of the Virgin. And then red again and yellow. Well, we can't be sure about Christ's clothes because the painting again has been restored a number of times. Here also it seems that this may be Rublev, and still another Annunciation depiction, this time with the incorporation of architecture. But as in Italy in the 12th century, considerably earlier, architecture is by itself and the figures are by themselves sitting in front of the architecture rather than being incorporated within the architecture. But the attitudes are gracious and calm, and that's what Rublev was known for. Here also is the painting of Saint Paul. It had not survived well, but we again see this calmness and self-possession of Rublev icons. And now we come to iconostasis, and the tradition of iconostasis developed in Moscow. And even though in the 14th century these iconostases are still rather humble, into the 15th century they will become just extraordinary. And the reason they have developed in Moscow is because Moscow became so wealthy, even far wealthier than Novgorod, and Novgorod was wealthy. And finally, Moscow could in fact demand the manpower and also the funds to do these iconostases. They were also extremely anxious to be connected to Constantinople and to bring in as many artists from Constantinople as possible, which is why this period of the 14th century, especially 15th century, sometimes is a little uncertain because, well, some of the artists may have been Novgorodian artists, then other artists came from Byzantium, so Moscow had not yet established its own identity in a way, but because its own identity in fact was, well, with Ivan III, the third Rome, and it will, and as opposed to Novgorodians' humanity and softness, Moscow will attempt to convey grandeur and ceremony, and so is with iconostasis. This one is one of the older ones, and that is in the Cathedral of the Annunciation. It's one of the oldest iconostases, and the icons there, they date from the 14th to the 17th centuries. And it's possible that some of them were painted by Andrei Rublev, Feofan Grek. The lowest row, or it's actually it says the fifth row, or it could be also said to be the first tier, is pierced by a silver door, behind which is found an old staircase to the Tsar's personal chambers. And here is the iconostasis that we saw last time. It comes from a place called Tikhvin, and it is located in Tikhvin Monastery of the Dormition of the Virgin, and it is a town which is about 150 miles east of St. Petersburg and used to be in the Novgorod region. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, the great composer, was born in Tikhvin into a noble Russian family. Yes, and it was a town in the Novgorod region. Now, with the iconostasis, it's akin the West's chancel screen separating the sanctuary from the body of the church, and from the 15th century on it developed into a bridge to heaven, as we looked in the previous lecture. And here I'll just quickly show you the tiers, because every icon has a certain place in an iconostasis. Not that sometimes they don't change places. But the first tier is always established. It's the holy door in the center, and then usually it's on the one side is the chair of the Holy Wisdom, the Virgin with Christ child in her lap, and that shows the first coming of Christ. And then on the other side, Christ as Pantocrator, which is the second coming. Sometimes you have Annunciation and 4 evangelists on the sides. Then the second tier, here in fact it's a third. Here it seems that the third and the second change places. Usually the second tier is the diocese, and which means supplication. And here you have Christ enthroned, and in this particular case, this is Christ enthroned. And clearly after Rublev, the majority of Christ enthrones in the diocese looked like this. Christ enthroned with saints and apostles, right there. Then the third tier, which in this case seems to be the second, is the festival tier. Crucifixion in the middle with life of Christ to the sides. Then the fourth is here. You have the Virgin Orans in the middle, and then on her sides prophets with David and Solomon on either side of the Virgin. And finally the fifth tier, God the Father and the patriarchs. So that's usually the order of the icons on the iconostasis. In very occasional cases there are 7 tiers, and since we're talking about Russian religion, just quickly, there are obviously plenty of crosses and types of crosses, as I had mentioned before. This is the Russian cross. And here it is, as I said, the upper register is Jesus Christ, King of the Jews. Then the lower one is the register, the board where Christ's hands were tied up, nailed. Then this specifies the Mount of Calvary, the steps as one goes up Mount Calvary. Here, as we saw it in the icon, is Longinus's spear with which he pierced Christ's side. And this is Stepaton's rod with which he gave him the sponge with vinegar. We see often there's a skull at the bottom, again as in the icon. That's the skull of Adam, whose sins were washed by Christ's blood. Here it says in Russian the Tsar Slavy, which is the Tsar of glory, then Jesus Christos, then Сын Божий is the Son of God. Then interestingly, here these words mean Nika or Nike. So this is the goddess of victory from the pagan antiquity, and it is incorporated in the Russian cross. And again, on the right side of Christ this register is lifted, and on the left side of Christ it's lowered. There are various crosses here. Latin, Greek, tau is a Greek letter tau. St. Peter's cross, because St. Peter was crucified upside down, so it is upside down. Papal cross, which incorporates all of them together. Russian Maltese cross. And last but not least, perhaps you were wondering what these vestments were about. We saw this icon in the past. The bishops and archbishops are conventionally depicted in liturgical garments. And these usually include a sakos, which symbolizes the tunic of disgrace, worn by Christ shortly before and during his crucifixion. Then there is an amaphorion that we saw also, that draped around the shoulders, which is a symbol of ecclesiastical and spiritual authority, and often a mitre, not in this case, which represents a special type of headgear decorated with small icons and precious stones. And then besides, bishops and archbishops can also be depicted in a phelonion, which is essentially a chasuble, which is often decorated with a pattern of multiple crosses. And here you have it. Well, we have come to the end of our icon observation, and I will see you soon. Thank you.